Good afternoon, evening, morning, maybe, everyone, and welcome to Charlemos. I'm thrilled to be hosting today's conversation with Dr. Rebecca Hanson, whose new book, Policing the Revolution, offers a groundbreaking look at the transformation of policing, governance, and coercive power during Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution. It focuses on more or less a 10-year period of field work, but kind of focuses on the entirety of Chavismo and the way that coercive power changed during this time. Um, like I said, drawing on more than a decade of field work, including hundreds of interviews with police officers, reformers, community members, and non-state armed actors, Dr. Hanson challenges some of the most common narratives about Venezuela. Rather than seeing the Chavista state as monolithic, her work reveals a far more complex story, one of internal conflicts, fragmented authority, and the unexpected ways revolutionary ideals reshaped the state's capacity for violence and control. Today, we're going to dive into her research journey, the surprising findings that emerged, and what Venezuela's experience can teach us about that revolution, policing, and the nature of state power in Latin America writ large. Becca, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Becca, can you begin simply by describing the security situation in Venezuela under Chavismo and then the role of the police? Like, who are the main actors?
Yeah, so I'll do my best. As you know, it's a very complicated and just like always changing landscape. But yeah, so just to give a kind of brief overview of the security situation, I think it's important to point out, I think Venezuela has, of course, received a lot of attention in terms of homicide and crime rates during Chavismo. But these things were actually on the rise before Hugo Chavez came into office during his first administration. So crime and security and police violence were already an issue in the country before 1999, before 2000. As I mentioned in the book, by the late 1990s, police forces in Venezuela were really competing for some of the highest number of abuses in the entire region. So these were already issues that were going on in the country. But as I document in the book and in some of my other work, these issues were really exacerbated by dynamics within Chavismo, which you already mentioned a little bit about. So, Chavismo produces massive disruption within state security institutions. It generates a lot of competition and mistrust between state security institutions and between state security institutions and the state itself. It results in infighting between government factions that really hamstrings any kind of policies that might have effectively addressed these issues. So I don't know if it's contrary to popular belief, but there were definitely some very interesting proposals that were put forward to try to deal with issues of crime and violence in the country, particularly when Chavez was in office. But any that might have been effective were completely hamstrung and watered down due to this infighting that I talk about in the book. And then I've talked about in my other work with David Smaldi and Veronica Subijaga. So by the mid 2000s, Venezuela becomes one of the most violent countries in the region. So the first kind of period of Chavez's administration, at least when measured by homicide rates. And you really see an upward trend in homicide rates that continued until about 2016 or 2017 when they start to drop but still remain high. And I'd be happy to talk about why maybe these homicide rates have dropped in recent years. But in general, the Bolivarian Revolution has really been characterized by some of the highest homicide rates in the region. So
Yeah, can you actually, if I can cut you off,
yeah.
You just referenced a minute ago an earlier book that you published with David Smaldi and Veronica Zubillaga called The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, which was published a year and a half ago. Is that
About, yeah, more or less. My memory is a little rough, but yeah. Thanks.
And in that book, kind of the big question that you ask, a terrific edited volume about violence in Venezuela that everyone should check out. You kind of pose this question, this paradox or puzzle of the fact that Chavez comes to power and enjoys kind of massive oil windfall profits, right? From more or less the moment he seizes power until at least 2007 and possibly even until 2013, right? And this allows him to improve social conditions and to really increase social spending, right? But this was accompanied by a rise in violence and,
Mhm.
as you say, I think a tripling of the homicide rate in Venezuela at
Yeah, in
this
some places
time.
more, depending on where you're looking. But yeah.
Would this have occurred, do you think, counterfactually, independent of the country's security strategy, or was it in part a consequence of the country's security strategy?
So do you mean the increase in violence? Would it have
Yeah.
occurred otherwise? No, I mean I think um, homicide rates in Venezuela, I think, would have most likely continued to rise for a number of reasons. One is that there was no effective approach to policing or police reform in the country for a number of years. The
Mm.
only really meaningful intent or attempt to reform the police occurred under Chavez between about 2008 till 2013 and his death. So there weren't any major approaches to policing that would have resulted in a reduction in homicide rates. I think one of the big, and I might be going off too far from your question, but I think and this is one of the arguments that I put forward in the book, is that one of the main reasons why homicide rates have increased so much in Venezuela over this time period is because certain policies and some factions within Chavismo have promoted what I refer to and what other scholars have referred to as a pluralization of violent or armed actors, right? And so there's the question of whether or not that would have happened um, had the Bolivarian Revolution not occurred, because as opposed to other places so the pluralization of violence and armed actors has been documented in multiple countries in the region, but this is highly associated with the transition from authoritarianism to democracy and associated with what are understood to be, in many cases, neoliberal governments. And the Chavista government was very distinct from these trends and transitions, right, in a number of ways. The reason why certain factions within Chavismo end up promoting this pluralization of armed actors has to do with their interest in protecting the Bolivarian Revolution. So one of the main drivers for this pluralization in Venezuela, so one of the way I put it in the book is that we see similar outcomes in Venezuela as we see in Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, these other places, but the mechanisms look very different. In the case of
Mm.
Venezuela, it's impossible to understand why violent and armed actors and criminal actors pluralize without understanding certain factions within the government's attempts to protect their political project.
Who are these armed actors, or who were the armed actors, and how have
Yeah.
they evolved over time?
Yeah, so one of the complicated things about studying policing in Venezuela is that there are so many police forces. I mean, it's just historically, since the 1980s, has been a highly decentralized security landscape. So there are over 140 police forces in the country, and that includes state, municipal, and national police forces. Then you also have the military, the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard, who participate in domestic security as well. So those are the kind of the state actors, the state armed actors that are operating in the country, and they oftentimes operate in the same territory and are competing for resources and for territorial control against each other. But then on top of that, and what's happened over the course of the Bolivarian Revolution is that you've seen the pluralization of colectivos, which I think there's a lot more awareness of them because of Venezuelan migration. There's a little bit more awareness of them outside of the Venezuelan context, but these groups really started in the 1970s and 1980s as community-based armed leftist organizations. I won't get into the history. I do in the book. So for people who are interested in learning more about them, I have a chapter on this. But because of their ideological affinity with the Chavez government and factions within the Chavez government, there are different types of relationships that are constructed between these colectivos and the government that results in the growth and increased number of colectivos. Yes.
So, for those listeners who may not be experts in Venezuelan politics,
Yes.
so the colectivos, what are colectivos? They emerged in the 70s and 80s, kind of as left-wing groups, community-based groups.
Mhm.
Do you mind describing a little bit more about colectivos for a second, how they might be related to violence or state repression?
Yeah, sure. I never know how deep to dive into this. Yeah, so they emerged in the 1970s and 1980s. They have a very conflictual relationship, an antagonistic relationship with governments until and not it was they didn't really even start constructing kind of these cooperative relationships with the Chavez government until 2002. So the reason why these relationships begin to be constructed between the Chavez government and colectivos is in the context of the 2002 coup, the failed coup d'etat, in which the Policía Metropolitana, the Metropolitan Police, which was the largest police force in the country at the time, and Metro Caracas, participated in that coup. So basically, after this coup is over with, the government is faced with this question, like, if we can't trust the police to protect us, if they're going to turn against us, then who can we trust? So this motivates certain groups within Chavismo to start to reach out to and construct relationships with the collectivos with the idea, of the armed but peaceful revolution, right? That Chavez starts to talk about, I think, 2005, 2006, which is that we are not going to actively engage in, according to the discourse, we're not going to actively engage in violent encounters with people with groups that are threatening us, but we will be armed and ready to protect ourselves if there's an invasion or something like that, right? And so the idea was that these groups would be kind of a backup plan if another attempt was made to remove Chavez from office. What ends up happening over the course of a number of years from 2002 onwards is that there's a certain degree of impunity that's extended to the colectivos, which only operated at this point in very particular sectors of Western Caracas. So they were very kind of limited to particular sectors, really just within the capital. So over the course of the number of years that this impunity is extended to the colectivos, there is some degree of support between the Chavez government and the colectivos. There's a debate about this, but there is some degree of financial support that is provided by the Chavez government to the collectivos, training as well. And so you see a number of new groups. So really, there are only about 3-4 colectivos, well-organized colectivos, and around 2002, 2003, then you just see a number of new collectivos popping up, claiming to have the same ideological affinity, and then receiving at least impunity, the extension of impunity by the government, and in some cases, financial resources as well. So what you see is this nascent relationship that starts because of the government's attempts to think about a future in which another coup occurs, or a future in which their political project is placed under threat. And kind of resource relationship and an expansion of rights and power, coercive power, particularly for the collectives. And by that, I mean they have the ability to engage in kind of like policing functions within their own territory. And then over the course of the Bolivarian Revolution, particularly under Maduro, they have become increasingly integrated into state policies and state plans to deal with things like to engage in political repression, right? So they've become increasingly integrated into the state in some ways. They've become increasingly participatory in repression against at least political protests. And as I document in the book, and I have in other work as well, have really become important governors. And by that, I mean they engage in governance in the territories that they control in Western Caracas and now in a couple of other cities.
So this is either an abdication of state power or an outsourcing of state power.
Yes.
Possibly to, depending on how you look at it, maybe to colectivos. Might you say the same thing about other groups, the Bolivarian militia, for example, or even the Pranato, the prison leaders called pranes? Would these be kind of similar ways in which maybe the government outsourced coercive power?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I talk about this as a coercive power, at the outsourcing, sorry, of coercive power, because this is a conscious decision that's made by some people within Chavismo. Again, there are certain factions within Chavismo that are very much so against this outsourcing, but I refer to it as an intentional outsourcing on the part of some state actors. I think it's a little bit harder. There's not a lot of research in this area. Very few of us are working on trying to collect empirical data on these topics. So I think with the pranes and, the context of Venezuelan prisons, most of the research really kind of documents more of a, state retreat, like rolling back of the state, an incapacity to control these prison spaces, or an unwillingness to. And then within that vacuum, you have gangs come forward to control prisons. So I think, at least in these initial years when people are talking about the pranes, there's this word in Venezuela that's used for men who run prisons that they're housed in at the time and kind of create prison gangs. I think that tends to be a much more kind of natural and organic process. It's less about the Chavez government or the Maduro government actually kind of trying to or like investing in or cooperating with these groups, and instead just, and as you said, like an abdication, and like we're no longer going to try to run the territory within these prison systems. But there is very good evidence, and my own research as well indicates that you see similar relationships being constructed, at least with gangs outside of prisons. And so this is a policy that starts to be implemented in 2013, 2014 under Maduro, that's referred to as the zonas de paz, which are peace zones. And these are actual negotiations, like concrete negotiations that are taking place between high-ranking members of the Venezuelan government and local gangs that have about 200 men in them for the most part. So in these negotiations, the government basically says, you know, we will tolerate certain illicit activities. We'll withdraw the police from your territory as long as you can keep the territory under control, basically. And as well as like reduce homicide rates. There are a couple of contingencies on this negotiation, but there's absolutely, and this is why kind of describing the security landscape and why I think it's important to talk about the transformation of a security landscape, because you have so many changes going on that are that have never been seen before in the country. And this is happening with so many different armed actors at the same time. And so you have the government constructing, evolving, and changing relations with the colectivos. You have the government constructing very fragile, pacted relationships with gangs in certain parts of the country. And then later on, you know, more recently with Tren de Aragua and groups like this kind of really working in some ways to construct similar pacts that break and put back together, break and put back together. But I think it is important here, particularly because of all the news that has been published on this topic recently. I think it's very important for people to understand that these are not, for the most part, consolidated relationships or even integrated relationships, at least between gangs and the Maduro government. I think between the colectivos and Maduro, yes. Between gangs and the Maduro government, these are very in many ways short-term relationships that facilitate the reaching of mutual interest between the two parties, right? But it's not about necessarily collaboration or even integration or anything like that. So I think it's important to note that.
Great. You know, I have several more questions about Venezuela. I'm going to ask you one additional Venezuela specific question. And I kind of want to move on and ask you bigger picture questions about the rest of the region and what lessons we might take away from what you show about Venezuela. So, you know, you describe Chavismo's internal conflicts as critical to this evolution of security policy. Could you share more about how these intra-state struggles shaped policing on at least the street level, if not the policymaking level?
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of different ways to think about this, but I think the police reform that I've mentioned before is perhaps one of the best examples of this, of how these intrastate or internecine struggles affect how police officers work and their kind of daily lives on the force. So the police reform that's implemented, it has its initial beginning in 2006, 2007, but really gets implemented and institutionalized in 2008 and 2009. And this reform, interestingly, was led by human rights activists that had decades of experience fighting against police violence in the country. So they were very much so pushing for a civilian approach to policing rather than a militarized approach to policing, which has historically been the state's approach to policing in the country long before Chavez came into office as well. And so the goal was to promote a civilian approach to policing, to really be able to restrict police power and actions, and to reduce police violence, as well as to create a police reform that really prioritizes what they talked about as dialogue over coercion. So really, I mean, all of this is encapsulated in the idea of a civilian police force. So the reform gets up and running. It creates a number of new institutions, including the Policía Nacional Bolivariana, the National Bolivarian Police. So this also really drastically changes and disrupts the security landscape, because this is a very different approach to policing. It puts different people in power in security institutions, mainly human rights activists rather than military officers or even politicians. But most factions within Chavismo do not support this reform. And it's really not even, as I mentioned, as I talk about in the book, it's really not even popular in the barrios and popular sectors. So it doesn't really gain support by most factions within Chavismo, nor does it have a lot of support by those who even like support Chavismo and identify as Chavistas, for a couple of different reasons. And so at the same time that you have a police reform that's attempting to restrict police actions and even restrict the types of weapons they can carry. So the reform implements a number of regulations on and restrictions on what types of weapons that the police can carry. They start to have to log bullets that are used on the job. So having to actually explain how these things are how any of these like coercive tools are being utilized. At the same time you have this going on, you have the pluralization of armed actors that I've mentioned before. So you have kind of a certain faction within Chavismo really trying to control the police and its coercive power, and you have other factions within Chavismo that are promoting the growth and expansion of groups that are not touched at all by this reform, right? That have complete and total impunity to be able to utilize coercion. No one is logging their their bullets. No one is keeping tabs on the weapons that they have access to. And you actually see armed actors gaining access to weapons that they've never had before during this time period for a couple of different reasons, right? And so this really affects the way that police officers understand the reform, and the way that they kind of experience on a day-to-day basis their own vulnerability. So, for example, there's one police officer I was talking to a number of years ago said something along the lines of, the government doesn't care that we have these really crappy bulletproof vests. They don't care that we have these tiny little pistolas. They don't care if colectivo members are shooting at us and one of us dies. It doesn't matter to them. So they very much so saw themselves as like in a struggle with collectivos, with the government, kind of for their own survival. And this just had very important implications for their kind of trust in the government and in the state. You just in terms of like a day-to-day level, police officers would decide whether or not to engage or intervene in certain in certain interactions based on whether or not they believe collectivo members were involved in that interaction. So for some police officers, they just preferred to kind of avoid any kind of interactions that might involve a collectivo member because of ideas that police officers and barrio residents have about the amount of the amount of power that collectivos had. And I think, so I'll just end with this. One of I think the best vignettes that I have in the book kind of that really, I think, shows how important this pluralization of violence that was state sponsored in some ways mattered for police officers. That one day I was watching this game of bolas criollas, which is kind of like a bocce ball game that's really popular in popular sectors in Venezuela. So I was watching it with a police officer and his uncle. And his uncle, who worked in Katia, which is one of the areas where the colectivos operate, was telling this story about a police officer that was being led out of the sector that he was charged with policing by colectivo members. And it's not only he's being led out of this sector by collectivo members, they've taken his own handcuffs and have handcuffed him with his own handcuffs. They've taken his own gun and are using his gun against him to lead him out of this sector. And the way that Edmundo responds to this story is like, I would just rather them kill me. This is such a humiliating experience for police officers that his response is, I would just rather die. And I think it's important to note here that this is an incredibly humiliating experience that police officers hold the state responsible for. Like they very much they see the state as responsible for this. And so I use this in and I talk about it when I'm discussing this issue, not necessarily because I think this police officer's uncle's account is necessarily representative of reality. It doesn't necessarily have to be representative of reality. Instead, what it does, it indicates how transformations that we know are going on, like the pluralization of violence, how that impacts the way police officers understand their relationship with the state, the way that they understand their own authority in these sectors, right? I mean, I think we'll probably get into this in a minute, but I think one of the biggest problems with police scholarship still is that the police are written about in Latin America as if they're these incredibly omnipotent forces. And instead, what we see are police forces being one of multiple armed groups that are vying for authority. They're vying for resources from the state, that are vying for impunity. And that's a very different way to think about policing than I think how even police reformers themselves think about what the problems with policing are.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm going to skip ahead actually to build off of that with a question that I had, which is, what do you think scholars and policymakers most misunderstand about the relationship, or about the police, first of all, in Latin America, and then about the relationship, at least in this case, between revolution, policing, and violence?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say, and I talk about this in the book's conclusion, I think one of the big issues with particularly scholarship on reform is there's absolutely no conversation that I've seen so far between this growing body of scholarship on the pluralization of armed actors in the region, not just in Venezuela, but in other places. So we know this is happening. We have good documented evidence of this pluralization, and not just a pluralization of armed actors, but armed actors who are governing the territories that they control. And I think that's really important, right? So we're not just talking about armed actors operating, but instead being able to govern territory and populations. So we have good documentation of that, and somehow that's not being taken into account by people who are talking about police reform. And I don't see any reality in which police officers are going to even, not necessarily even understand, but feel safe with proposals to reduce their own access to weapons or their own use of force when there are multiple other armed and coercive actors that are not at all being restricted, right? And I think that this is the biggest problem to me with police reform scholarship right now, is that create they provide recommendations as if the state has a monopoly on violence. And this is, a very classical understanding of kind of a state characteristic that over by and large, it is the institution that is able to wield um, violence in an effort to govern populations, right? And that's just not the case anymore. So we really have to, I think, rethink police power within this context. And I think there was another question that you asked. I don't think I got to it. About the relationship between revolution, policing, and violence. Yeah, so I think this is another topic that really has to be updated because so much of our scholarship on the relationship between revolution, policing, and violence comes from the 20th century. And for revolutions that made it, that didn't just collapse, what scholarship shows is that historically, revolutions have produced stronger states with highly coordinated and centralized security forces that are capable of protecting, a political project. And that's just not the case in the 21st century
Oh,
anymore, I think. I mean, if you
no, at least in Latin America, right?
yeah, at least in Latin America, and I think in other places as well, but definitely in Latin America. I mean, if you look at Venezuela, not just Venezuela, but Nicaragua as well. I mean, we're not talking about states that have um, successfully coordinated and strengthened institutions, right? Instead, what you see is kind of like a dispersal of different types of powers across different groups that aren't even necessarily controlled by the state.
Is that because they're revolutionary or is that because they're personalist?
So I do think it's revolutionary. I mean, at least in the case of Venezuela, again, I don't think you can really understand how. So I refer to this as a dispersal of coercion, but we can also just talk about the pluralization of armed actors. You really cannot understand that without understanding the revolutionary ideology that Chavismo, I think, is operating under. So I think that there might be a relationship, of course, between revolutionary projects and personalist politics, but I don't think that you can separate out the revolutionary aspect in the case of Venezuela to understand what's going on with the police. And I think too, what's very important here, and is another point that I try to highlight a lot in the book, is that because of 20th century scholarship, we tend to think that police in these revolutionary contexts, and I think this is where revolution really matters. We kind of tend to think that police in these revolutionary contexts are operating at the behest of the state and they are engaging in the actions they're engaging in because they are either politically aligned with the government, or they're at least trying to protect the state's interests, right? And if the ethnographic work that I have, and I think some other people in other contexts as well, but at least just thinking about my own work, just completely and totally dispels this idea. So if the issue of police violence in a revolutionary context is not about political affiliation, or is not even about police officers feeling that they need to
Mhm.
protect the state's interests, that presents a very different problem for scholars of policing and revolution, I think.
Yeah. Moving kind of beyond this idea of just revolution, in what ways are security policies of left-wing leaders different from those of right-wing leaders? Right now in Latin America, there's an ongoing debate about policing policies under Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, under the recently reelected Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, even Javier Milei in Argentina. Peru is considering changing policing policies as a response to increased criminality, especially in Lima, but also northern Peru. Kind of across the region right now, there seems to be this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So, what differences do you see between the left and the right, if any,
Mm-hmm.
at least in Latin America?
Yeah, so I mean, I think first to be able to effectively answer this question, we just need more research on how the left approaches policing crime and violence in the region. I mean, we have a not a huge body of scholarship, but we have a pretty significant body of scholarship now that's thinking about the relationship between the right and security policies, which is largely focused on kind of the way that the right's support for neoliberalism has affected policing and security policies, and then how mano dura policies, these punitive approaches to policing, have been promoted by the right. But we know almost next to nothing about really the left's approach to these issues. That's not to say that we don't have scholarship on the police in leftist countries. There's plenty of scholarship on the police in Brazil, but it's not looking at the relationship between the leftist governments in that country and how that shapes policing. There's very little of that. So I think first we just need more scholarship that's taking this on as a problem, because I think historically, at least in the past few decades, the problem has been identified as right-wing governance. Like they're the ones who are driving the problem of inefficient and violent security policies in the region. And so I think we just need to pay more attention, first of all, to how left-wing governments are approaching this issue. In the case of Venezuela, at least, again, this is where I say that we see outcomes that are very similar to right-wing countries in Venezuela, but for different reasons, right? And so I think one of the important things that is taken into account here, or that we need to take into account here, I'm sorry, is that there seems to be a convergence now, not thinking about Chavez in some ways, but mostly Maduro, but there really seems to be a convergence. And also Honduras, under what's supposedly kind of like a left-wing government, there are a number of different like leftist countries that have very much so thrown their weight behind punitive approaches to policing, not just punitive, but incredibly violent and like incredibly lethal approaches to policing.
Are those normally associated with the right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is very much so associated with the right. And there's some surveys, research that shows that countries where there's more support for right-wing governments, there's more support for these kind of heavy-handed policing policies. And I just don't think that's the case anymore. I mean, you can even think about the case of the United States. So it looks like Latin America is moving closer to where the United States is that there has been a convergence in the United States around very punitive approaches to policing in the past 20 yeah, and really in the past 20, maybe 30 years. And I think that's what's happening in Latin America as well. But I think it's important to note that the discourse around these punitive policies is very different. Potentially the reasons for supporting those policies might be different. But I do think that convergence is a really, really important aspect to take into account.
So given that, I have probably the easiest question of the day, which is, given the problems with these kind of opposing possibly approaches to policing, maybe not opposing, but at least different approaches to policing, what should policing look like, and what should state security policy be?
So I won't even get into what policing policies should look like. What I will get into is, I think, what has to happen before any kind of effective alternative approach to policing and security could happen. So I think, and this is a long-term conversation in the region, but there has to be an effective way to, pull the military out of policing and security strategies. That's a very, very difficult topic to address in the region, and is increasingly so in Venezuela because the military have become so much integrated into state and society, particularly under Maduro. I mean, I think people think that really happened under Chavez. It really much so happened much more under Maduro than it did under Chavez. And so if we were talking about the difficulties of like getting the military out of security under Chavez, it's so much worse now under Maduro. And so I think that kind of figuring out a way to have that conversation in a way that's appealing to the opposition, for example. I mean, this is something that I think is a really important point to make, that it's not clear that if there is a transition in Venezuela, that the political opposition will support conversations about, getting the military out of policing, or even like reducing these punitive policies. So I think that's an important step, one that we could talk about for weeks on end about how to do that. But that's an important one. I think, too, as I've already mentioned, there's absolutely no way to think about any kind of effective police reform or security policies without getting a handle on the different armed actors that exist in a territory and how they're going to operate together. And there are a number of different discussions and suggestions about how to deal with this in recent scholarship. Some of it looking at pacts between states and gangs that have been relatively successful for a certain period of time at reducing homicide rates and certain types of crime rates. But I think until you admit that this is the landscape that we're living with now, of fragmented state sovereignty, of multiple armed actors competing against each other, state and non-state, there's no way to even start thinking about what like a useful police reform would look like. And at least in the case of Venezuela, maybe somewhat ironically, there's the issue of gun presence in the country. I think there's absolutely no way to really start to think about an effective approach to reducing violence in the country without addressing that issue. So this is something I look at in one of the chapters I talk about in one of the chapters of my book, is that, I mean, weapons imports into Venezuela really from 2009 onwards I think increased by something like 300%. So just like access to weapons. So until you can really kind of, I think, make both citizens, but also police officers feel safe and a little bit less vulnerable doing the work that they have to do, it's really difficult to have a conversation about more effective or progressive security policies. Oh, I think you're muted, John.
Me esquivaste. You dodged my question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I
Very
did.
nicely, very nicely. No, I understand, and I probably agree with what you say. You know, demilitarization of policing, getting a handle on existing armed actors, all of these things that have to happen before even thinking about how to redesign security policy, certainly.
Mhm.
And
And I
maybe
think until we really deal with that issue, it's kind of a moot point to discuss what good security policies would look like, because I think that's the issue now, is that people are discussing good security policies being implemented in, like, an ideal landscape. And until we kind of deal with the urgent
worst do
problem.
not hold a monopoly on the legitimate use of
Yeah.
force in many cases, for sure. So absolutely, I have so many other questions. We're at 2:40, so maybe I should pivot back to Venezuela and then have a concluding question, to maybe two questions to go, and see if people have questions for you in the chat. How has the security landscape changed in Venezuela since you wrote this book? One thing that we're hearing an awful lot about in the news is this thing called Tren de Agua, which emerged probably in about 2015 around the Tocoron prison in Aragua state, and out of a pranato there, right? Out of a kind of a prison gang hierarchical relationship thing. And we're hearing about that in the United States. Is Tren de Agua, well, two parts. First of all, just how has that landscape changed? And is Tren de Agua a big part of that security landscape and your concerns about things in Venezuela? And second of all, how concerned should I be here living in Washington, D.C. about Tren de Agua committing a crime?
Yeah. So yeah, those are easy questions to wrap up with. Yeah. So in terms of how the security landscape has changed in Venezuela in recent years, as I mentioned at the beginning, there has been a decrease in violence when measured by homicide rates, a pretty significant decrease, which never occurred during the Bolivarian Revolution until 2016. And so that's an important change. Trump and Republican politicians here have chalked that up to the Venezuelan government exporting criminals to other countries. Some people have chalked this up to migration rates. The Maduro government has chalked this up to what it refers to as its successful policing strategies and policies, which hopefully my book demonstrates that that's impossible as a reason to understand why violence has decreased, at least. So what I'm working on, and I discuss this a little bit in the book, but kind of my new project that I'm working on with Veronica Subijaga, a little bit more intensely now is kind of trying to think about how security policies in Venezuela over this time period resulted in a consolidation of certain gangs. And when you have gangs consolidate, one, they're no longer fighting with each other, which is going to reduce the homicide rates. And two, they have a coercive ability, not just a coercive ability, but also they have uh, an ability to control populations through the provision of resources and services. So you actually have a much more effective security force that's operating in this territory where a gang is consolidated. And when I say effective security force, I mean the gang itself, right? And so in places where either the police had a very efficient control over homicide rates or violence before, in places where you've had gang consolidation, I think that's a better explanation for why violence has decreased, at least in some places in Venezuela. Um, so in terms of another like big transformation that's happened in the security landscape. So I'll get to Tren de Aragua in a minute, but this Tren de Aragua is one gang that is part of this evolution of gangs that has taken place in Venezuela since 2013, 2014, which is kind of what I just referred to, which is like this appearance of large, better organized gangs that have never existed in the country. So, in contrast to Colombia or other countries in the region, Venezuela really never had large coordinated gangs until much later in its history, really till 2013, 2014. Before that time period, most gangs were very small. I mean, actually all gangs in the country, other than along the border, and that had to do with Colombia, were very small, very poorly coordinated, and very much so like neighborhood based. And so from 2013, 2014 onwards is where we start to see this phenomenon of what people refer to as mega bandas in the news, right? These very large organizations, much larger criminal organizations that have ever existed in the country. So I think that's that's a very important change that took place during the time I was doing my research. But, and this is related to the third point that I'll make, as you know, you and other scholars have worked on, there has been an authoritarian consolidation in Venezuela in recent years that has allowed, I think, the state to become less dependent on these armed actors than it was in the past. And I say that because the government has invaded the territory of many of these gangs in recent years and has attempted, and in some cases successfully wiped them out, suggesting that they no longer feel like they need to depend on these kind of pacts and negotiations with gangs. So I think understanding how authoritarian consolidation is affecting the consolidation of criminal governance now is really important. I think that relationship looks really different in recent years in comparison to the most of the time that I was doing my research for this book. In terms of Tren de Aragua, this is very much so connected, right? So, and Tren de Aragua, I think, has had the same trajectory as what I just described as many other mega bandas. That, it was started probably in 2014 in Tocoron, in the prison in the state of Aragua. Became increasingly consolidated and powerful, really from kind of 2017 onwards, largely due to taking advantage of like Venezuelan migration to other countries in the region. And did become a very important, I think, player in different illicit trades and activities for a number of years. I think in recent years, and the little bit of empirical scholarship we have suggests that Tren de Aragua is not the organized and consolidated present now as it was in the past. So, for example, in 2023, the Venezuelan government invaded the Tocoron prison. With the stated goal of removing the Tren de Aragua members who lived there. That did not work, but they did take control back over of the prison that Tren de Aragua had previously controlled. And a little bit of empirical data that we have shows that invasion has very much so affected the kind of the coordinated capacity of Tren de Aragua. And so what it seems like now exists in terms of Tren de Aragua is that you have some franchising. So you have, small groups that have kind of broken off from Tren de Aragua, migrated to other places, and have some kind of informal relationship with Tren de Aragua. But we're not talking about any kind of transnational presence or even kind of like trans-regional presence per se, at least some police reports will differ with me on that, but at least the good empirical data that we have suggests this is not about a coordinated transnational organization, but instead migration that has resulted in some franchising. And I think it's also important to note that there have been multiple documented cases of people claiming to be Tren de Aragua members or leaders that are not, that end up not being the case in other countries. So it's we have so much more bad information about the Nicaragua than we do have reliable information. So I'll kind of just like close by saying the reliable information that we have I think suggests and shows that there has been some migration of Nicaragua members to the United States. That Nicaragua previous members have engaged in some degree in different crimes here, but there's no evidence that that is being orchestrated by Nicaragua in Venezuela, that there's any kind of coordinated presence by Tren de Aragua in the United States, or that, and this is much less likely, that the Maduro government is in some way kind of orchestrating that. So my argument about whether or not we should be worried about the like Tren de Aragua invading the United States is I think there's absolutely no good empirical basis for that, for believing that. And I think we should be more worried about what is the political motives and what's being
Mm.
achieved under the discourse of Tren de Aragua. That is a much more dangerous, I think,
Here in the United States, you're
here in
saying.
the United States. Yeah, I think that is a much more dangerous issue than Tren de Aragua itself.
Yeah, for listeners or viewers, I guess, who haven't seen this, Becca co-authored a really terrific op-ed in the New York Times recently with David Smiley and Veronica Subillaga, right? It was the three of you,
Mhm.
correct?
Yes.
Yeah, about this issue, kind of dispelling some of the myths. Charles Larrett Smith and I also wrote something uh, late last year on the same topic. Becca also mentioned something that I will only promote in the 50-minute depths of this conversation, which is Authoritarian Consolidation Times of Crisis, Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro, which is an edited book that Raul Sanchez Uribarri and I put together. Becca has a terrific chapter in that volume. The book's been out for less than a month, and I encourage viewers to check that out as well. In addition to Becca's earlier edited book, to this book that she wrote, and to all the other terrific work that she's doing. So, Becca, I'm going to move into Q&A here from listeners. I have one question here in the chat. If anyone else who is watching or listening and has a question, please feel free to share that in the webinar chat. Scott Morgenstern asks, what is the threat to democracy, given the level of crime in the region, as well as the resulting support for mano dura policies? What does that tell us? Should we be worried?
Yeah, I think we should have been worried a long time ago about this issue. It seems very clear that in many countries, including Venezuela, both qualitative research and survey research shows that people feel that a decision has to be made about their security and about kind of democratic approaches to, I think, policing and politics as well. And when you have to make that decision, people will choose their security. So yeah, I mean, I think this has for a number of years been a threat to democracy in the country, and it's one that again is one of these issues that I think is very difficult to kind of figure out how to roll back, because I think once people are on a daily basis concerned about their security and don't feel that kind of a democratic government approach to that can address the issue, it's very difficult to build trust back up in democratic institutions to be able to defend people's security. I mean, I will say one of the differences between this book and the other books that have been looked at is that I'm trying to actually kind of move beyond a little bit this conversation, because I think that within a lot of scholarship there is a large conversation about how increasing violence and crime is related to democratization, and affects people's perceptions and beliefs about democracy. And what I'm trying to show in this book is that all these issues also arise when we're watching a transition from democracy to authoritarianism, which I think is not something we would anticipate based off of 20th century scholarship. And so I think my call is kind of to say this is a problem with within both democratic and authoritarian contexts. They're very, it presents differently and will have different problems and solutions. But I think this is not an issue that is being utilized and is being faced by both democratic and authoritarian governments.
Yeah. Thank you. So I want to pivot to two final questions for you. And the last one just wraps up. So I want to know, I'm just particularly curious about the field work that you did. You did field work for 10 years in a place where it's really difficult, like notoriously difficult to do field work. What is the biggest thing that surprised you about your ethnographic work in Venezuela?
Um,
If
well,
anything.
yeah, no. I mean, I think the first thing that jumps to mind is I don't think it's necessarily related to the topics of the conversation we've been having. It's related to my other research, but this might sound a little bit strange, but one of the things that was most surprising, I was already prepared to be doing research in a difficult context, in a risky context, particularly, a risky context for like getting someone from the United States studying these topics. So I thought about that a lot and had prepared for that a lot. For a couple of different reasons that I discuss in the methods chapter of this book. I was not at all prepared for the amount of sexual harassment that I dealt with while I was doing this research. That sounds like it should be obvious, but other work that I have, other research that I've done talks about why a lot of us go into the field without anticipating this problem. So the biggest surprise, I guess, and thing that I had to learn how to deal with was kind of navigating how to conduct research in already risky, very kind of delicate context and situation, and added on to that, navigate relationships that were very much so defined by sexual harassment on a very consistent basis. I would say that, and then the other part, which I've kind of referenced a little bit in the talk, but I have an entire chapter in the book, is very much so the way that my thoughts about police power changed, and men who join the police, who they are, basically, like that changed very much for me over the course of fieldwork. And by that I mean, it's been recognized in some, in scholarship a little bit over the past few years that police officers in much of Latin America come from marginalized sectors. They're poor men. They're the exact same men who join gangs. So we're talking about men who join the police. We're talking about a population of men who decide to join one of two armed groups. Mostly, they either join gangs or they join the police. And I think that's really important to take into account, unless we take into account the way that these men's lives have been shaped by violence, and their childhoods and adolescent and things like that have been shaped by conflictive spaces and insecure spaces, then I think we're leaving out a really important aspect of understanding why police officers operate the way that they do, why they believe what they believe. And there's just an incredibly important aspect of growing up in violent, insecure spaces and then becoming someone charged with policing those violent, insecure spaces that I think we need a lot more work on.
Thank you. 4 minutes left. So why don't we conclude with a grand flourish? What should our takeaway be from your book, Becca, and your research, and not just this book, but kind of your career of research looking at these issues and your expertise in policing and Venezuela? What should we know?
Yeah, well, I think you kind of mentioned this at the very beginning of the talk. I mean, I think one of the important takeaways for me is for people to come away with a more nuanced understanding of the Bolivarian Revolution. Again, I think if we think that the problem of policing and violence in Venezuela is a problem of an authoritarian state that has coordinated state security forces, that efficiently engages in any kind of like policing function that we associate with the police, if we think that that's the problem, that's a very different problem from what I show in the book. So the solutions to issues of policing and violence, whenever there might be a transition in Venezuela, is going to look very different depending on the narrative that you follow. And I hope that my book suggested this idea that first, the that the Bolivarian Revolution was always already authoritarian, and then also that this was like a linear pathway, just becoming increasingly authoritarian. I hope that my book dispels a little bit of that, because I think it's very, very important whenever we do start to think about any kind of transitions and moves back to democracy, to get that story right. So that's a really important, I think, like, takeaway for me. I think another really important takeaway from the book is a push for a much more nuanced understanding of how police officers understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And this has a lot to do
Yeah.
with really dispelling this idea that police officers are engaging in the actions they are because they are actually trying to protect the state's interests. So what I say in the way I position this in the book is that this does not mean that at the end of the day, police actions do not benefit the state. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day, police actions do not actually work in the interests of the state, but understanding why police officers are engaged in these actions that might end up benefiting the state, and that these actions are driven by interests that are not aligned with the state, I think is really important. So kind of understanding that this frayed relationship between the police and the state, and understanding that outcomes of the state benefiting police actions doesn't mean the police are trying to protect the state with all of their actions and actions of violence.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for an entire hour of knowledge. This is, to the best of my knowledge, the first Charlemos that we've had with a single interviewee, and you have managed it
Goodness.
brilliantly. Yes. Uh,
I'm glad you didn't tell me that before then.
no, I wasn't going to. Listen,
Thank you so much for the questions. They were
so
wonderful.
so so Dr. Rebecca Hanson, her book is Policing the Revolution, which looks at the transformation of policing, governance, and coercive power in Venezuela under Chavismo. Becca, thank you so much for your time today. I also want to thank the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh and Interim Associate Director Luis Van Fossen Bravo for setting up the logistics of this, and for Caitlin Kennedy as well for putting things together. We can't do this, our Charlemos work, without everyone putting in a great deal of effort behind the scenes. Thank you once again, Becca, and I have read part of your book. I look forward to finishing it.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a wonderful conversation.
Bye-bye.
Bye.